All right, well, hey, I'm glad you're here today. As Whitney said in the video, we're wrapping up a series today, but it's actually even a little bit broader than that. So if you're new, I know there's a lot of new folks here today for Baptism Sunday. We're in the middle of a long journey as a church family. We're doing something we've never done before. We're doing kind of a bunch of sub-series, but they're all part of one big series that is 31 weeks long, and we're right in the middle of it. So let me get you caught up on what that looks like so that way you're not totally confused about what we're doing today. We've been working through a book called The Story. Now, if you're not familiar, many of you may not be, but if you're not familiar with what this is the Bible, but easier to understand. It is Bible verses, Bible passages that are put into chronological order. So it's in the order that it actually appears, not in the Bible, because the Bible's not all in chronological order, but in the story, it's in chronological order. And then there's some stuff cut out of it that is important, but that sometimes can make it a little bit harder to understand the big picture story. And our goal here throughout this journey as a church is to help all of us understand better the one big story the Bible is telling. Because it is telling one big story. And that one big story is completely life-changing, but it can be hard to see sometimes. So today we're in chapter 6 of the story. Where we've been so far, there's this timeline we've got. Where we've been so far, we've covered creation and the fall and the flood. That was chapter 1. We've covered a man named Abraham. We've covered a man named Joseph. And we're now in the third week dealing with a man named Moses, who is one of the most important characters in the Bible. Now, what I need you to know at this point, again, if you've been around, you've heard this stuff, but if you're new today, just so that today makes sense, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to summarize all that we've covered so far. There's a creator God who loves us. He created all that we can see, all that we know. He created you and he created me. He created humanity. And when he created people, he said, that is my crowning achievement. That is the point of all of this. And what we see in the early part of the Bible is that God wants to be with us. That's always been his hope. That's always been his dream. That's always been his plan and his purpose. And yet humanity is not very good at doing the things that are necessary for God to be with us. And so there's this moment in time where the first two people decide that they're not going to trust God. They're not going to do what God says, and they introduce sin into the human condition, and it breaks our relationship with God. And then the rest of the Bible is one big story of how God goes to the ends of the earth to get us back because he cares about us so much. And the beginning of that rescue plan, it starts with that man named Abraham. And it continues on down through. But what's interesting in the Bible is that God doesn't just do the whole thing at once and say, this is what's happening and that's the end of it. Rather, he reveals this rescue plan over a long period of time, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because God needed us to know what's in our hearts. Because just like the first two people, we aren't very good at listening to what God wants us to do. And as a result, we don't even recognize it, but often we break our relationship with him time and time again. And he doesn't want that. He wants to be with us. And so as we've walked through this story, we've looked at these two kind of parallel things going on. The Bible is full of what we're calling the upper story and the lower story. You can think of the lower story as our experiences, our understanding, our ability to see the world and the events that happen around us. Kind of just our natural human eyes. The Bible's full of the lower story. In fact, when we read the Bible, we read it through the lens of our lower story. But there's something else happening the whole time. There's an upper story that God is trying to tell. That in particular moments people don't understand. And in our lives today, we often don't see what God is up to in the upper story, but that upper story drives everything else forward, and it shows us the plans and the purposes of God. So today what we're gonna do as we enter into chapter 6, God has begun this rescue plan, and he said, my rescue plan is gonna involve a family that I'm gonna make into a great nation. And that nation, I'm gonna bless the whole world through them. They are gonna be my people. I'm gonna be their God. And they're gonna be a demonstration of who I am to the world. Well, things don't go great for them, and not that long after, they end up being slaves in Egypt for 400 years. But God did that for a reason too. And at the end of all that, God delivered the nation of Israel in a mighty way. And he did it to demonstrate his power and his might to the Egyptians who enslaved them, but he also did it to demonstrate his power and his might to the Israelites who were his people. He wanted them to see what he was capable of. He wanted them to see how much he loved them, and he wanted them to see that there was nothing that could stand against him. Now, as God delivers Israel, he leads them into the desert toward what they call the promised land. It was a land that God had promised Abraham many, many years before, but they had never been able to occupy it. And God says, we're going. And so last week we covered what we call house rules. There's this one particular point where God delivers Israel from the hand of the Egyptians and leads them through the Red Sea and splits the sea. It's this incredible story. And then they get to the other side and God's like, all right, now I got to tell you how to live. You don't know how because you've only ever been slaves. But I need you to learn how to live as my people, not as slaves. And so he lays out all kinds of rules, tons and tons of rules. I don't know about all of you, but I'm not a rules guy. I don't like them. I don't like them at all. I want to break the rules. It just seems fun to me. Like, see if they're real or not. So this part of the Bible can be troublesome, but if you understand that what God was doing was saying, if you're going to be my representatives in this world, I need you to know what it looks like to represent me. I need you to know what it looks like to be my people. And so God implements all these rules, and then we get to today, to chapter 6. At this point, God has delivered Israel. He has demonstrated his power. He has demonstrated his might. He has demonstrated who he is and said, this is how I need you to live so that people will see me in you. And then, as chapter 6 unfolds, we find out that it's been 2 years since God delivered since God delivered Israel from Egypt. He has provided, he has been faithful. But there's a shift that happens right at the beginning of chapter 6. When I say chapter 6, by the way, I'm referencing this book. It is broken up into chapters. If you're interested, by the way, there are copies in the back. As chapter 6 unfolds, there's a shift in the story, and that shift is crucial. Because today, the story, for those of you that have been a part of this journey, maybe you read the chapter going into this week. Hopefully you picked up on some of the themes that I'm going to talk about today. But today is a critically important chapter. It's critically important because it illustrates, in the most powerful way it has to this point, one of the most fundamental issues with humanity. And it highlights what I think is the number one reason why we have a hard time entering into and living in God's upper story, and why we stay in the lower story so often, not experiencing the peace and the power and the presence of God the way that he wants us to. So as chapter 6 unfolds, there's this shift. And it's a shift in God's, in his demeanor toward his people. At first, it might be a little bit troublesome, because God begins to become much more frustrated with Israel than he has been before. Up to this point in the story, Israel has done some things that God's been like, all right, come on guys, let's get it together. But at the beginning of chapter 6, he begins to become very frustrated. In fact, the beginning of chapter 6 has what I think is one of the funnier stories in all the Bible, where Israel's griping about how they don't have enough food. And God's like, all right, you want food? I'll give you food. I'm going to give you so much of this food that it's going to come out of your mouth and out of your nostrils, and you're going to eat it until you hate it. I just think it's funny. Like, I wouldn't do that to my kids, but I'd think about doing that to my kids. You know? Yeah. So here's the thing. As the story continues, and as God begins to become much more frustrated with Israel, it can feel problematic, because it feels like, well, God's supposed to be loving, God's supposed to be kind, and here God's like really aggravated with Israel and saying kind of harsh things to him. But here's the image that I want you to have in your head. If you don't have kids, this ain't gonna work great for you. If you do, this is gonna make a ton of sense. Imagine for a moment you save up your money, you spend a bunch of time planning, and you take a big family vacation to Disney World. The happiest place on earth. Yeah. Well, if you've ever been to Disney World, you know, first of all, that's not true. It is great. But imagine for a moment you take this trip, and that a day in, your kids start saying, it's too hot. I don't like the food. Why are we here? Can we just go home? Now, as a good, loving parent, you're gonna be encouraging, right? And you're gonna be like, hey, listen, we're gonna have such a good time these next 9 days. We're gonna have so much fun. And it's gonna be so much fun that the drive home is gonna be amazing too. And so you're optimistic and you're hopeful, like it's gonna get better. Well, then the next day they wake up and, I don't want to be out of bed yet. Breakfast, this is gross. It's too hot again today. Your patience is going to be a little shorter, a little thinner, right? What happens on the third day or the fourth? There's going to come some point where as a parent, you're going to be like, would you just shut up already? Do you have any idea what we've done to make this happen for you? You ungrateful child? Right? I don't know what words you would use. I don't know what words I would use in that scenario. But what I know is that the patience that I had initially for it would grow progressively shorter the more ungrateful my child was for all that we did to make that. Now, look, here's the reality. The kid doesn't have the perspective. They don't know. But when I read this story, and when I read how frustrated God starts to get with Israel, it's the same thing. This is God being like, you've seen what I've done, right? Like, you've seen what I did to Egypt. You've seen what I did to the Red Sea. You've seen how I've provided manna for you every single day of these last 2 years. You've seen all this, right? So why don't you trust me? And I think that's an emotion that most of us can understand. And so while we might read it and go, well, why isn't God being more patient? Would you be? I wouldn't be. Now, as the story continues, that God eventually leads the nation of Israel to the border of the promised land. In fact, there's a town mentioned, Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea ended up being the southernmost city of the tribe of Judah. So they are on the doorstep of the promised land. They've been waiting for this for hundreds of years. God's given them the house rules. He's gotten everything aligned and they're ready to enter. And so God gives some instructions. We're going to pick up the story in Numbers chapter 13, or if you're in your storybook, it's page 74. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which, if you're a note taker, you may want to underline because this is important, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. All right, so we're going to pause there. They're on the border. God says, send a scouting party from each ancestral tribe. So that's going to be 12 people for those who are not aware. There's going to be 12 different individuals, each leaders from their tribes. And again, I had you underline I am giving because the tense there is actually really important. God speaks this in the present tense. Not I have given, not I am going to give, but I am giving. That's significant in what's to come. So they send the scouting party. And about 40 days later, the scouting party returns. And their report is essentially, it's incredible. It's all God told us it would be. But they got real big cities and real big people. And we can't beat them. In fact, at one point they say, we looked like grasshoppers compared to the people who are there already. And then those leaders who come back, they do a terrible thing. They begin to spread this report amongst the nation of Israel at large. They go back to their own tribes and they tell everybody, it's amazing, but like if we go in there, we're dead. We can't do anything. Now what's the problem with that? The problem is that God has already said, I'm giving it to you. Like it's happening right now. I'm giving it to you. And we see the beginnings of what become the big problem with this story. That rather than listening to what God says and trusting what God has already done, the way he has proven himself time and time and time and time again, the people see what's right in front of them and they go, oh, we can't do anything about that. Well, it gets worse. We're going to skip forward one chapter in the Bible, page 76 in your storybook. Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. That night, all the members of their community raised their voices, and they wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a new leader, and we should go back. Now, to us reading this today, this sounds insane. Why would you trade freedom, future, hope, to go back and live as slaves. But this is not the first time Israel has said this. This is not the first time they've gotten on this train. And them being in this place, it just reinforces the condition of the human heart is to look at the things in front of us and wrongly assume that they are bigger than God. God has already said for hundreds of years that he's going to give the promised land. He has said in this specific context, I'm giving this land to you right now. But Israel is afraid. And it's understandable in a sense. But not everyone is afraid. There are two men who were part of the scouting party, a man named Joshua and a man named Caleb. And as the Israelites are all saying, we should go back to Egypt, Joshua and Caleb speak up. And they say, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. And do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. And for like the briefest of moments, you think, okay, somebody's stepping up. Somebody's doing the right thing. Somebody has the right perspective here. This is exactly the perspective the nation of Israel needed to have. It was not, they're not big. It was not to ignore reality, but it was to say, God has already told us and we can trust him. And no matter how big they are, God's bigger. So if God says it's gonna be ours, it's gonna be ours. We just need to not be afraid. But as much hope as there might be in this moment, the very, very next verse says, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. So they're like, nope. We're going to kill them. Let's kill Moses and Aaron, appoint new leaders, and we'll just go back to Egypt. That's better. Better plan. This is a pivotal moment in the story of the Bible. One of the most pivotal moments in all the story of the Bible. It's the final straw for God. He's had it. This is all right, pack your bags, we're going home. I'm not doing this stupid vacation. I'm not going back into that dumb park with you if you're going to act like this. Let's go. No, please, nope. I've given you 450 chances. I've spent $9 million on food here because every meal costs $1 million. Well, I'm done. If this is how you're going to act, let's go. And so God makes a crucial decision. Numbers 14, verse 28. God's talking to Moses, and he has told Moses, I've had it, I'm done with this. And in fact, God in one moment says, I'm just gonna destroy Israel and start over. Now, interestingly, we actually spent some time talking about this in my story small group this past week, not this specific thing, but this kind of thing where it appears in the Bible that God changes his mind. Because God says, I'm gonna destroy Israel, and Moses says, no, please don't. And then Moses reminds God of who God has said he is, compassionate, gracious, slow to mercy, abounding in love and faithfulness. He reminds him, and Moses says, you promised us, please have mercy on your people. And God says, okay. And so it's this moment where it looks like God totally changes his mind based on the words of a person, which can cause some problems sometimes for people. The reality is, I don't think God changed his mind at all. The reality is, I think God was testing Moses. Now, you can agree or disagree with that interpretation. I think he was testing Moses. I think he was saying, hey, do you still believe that I am who I've said that I am? Do you still trust what I've said about who I am? And in this moment where I'm going to say something that's out of character for me, are you going to speak up and boldly remind me of what I have said? Not because I've forgotten it, because I need to know where you stand right now. And so Moses does. He speaks up and he reminds God of who God has said he is. And God says, okay, I won't destroy them, but there's going to be consequences for their choices. Numbers chapter 14, starting in verse 28, God says, so tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. You said it'd be better if we just died in the wilderness. I can make that happen. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb and Joshua. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I'll bring them into the land. I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is to have me against you. Now, that's harsh. In this moment, it feels like God is a cruel, unforgiving, unjust God. This could be one of the passages that somebody could look at and say, this is why I don't believe in this God. Because why would he do that? Here's the problem. If we look at it from a lower story perspective, that's a perfectly acceptable position. Through our lens, through our understanding, it doesn't make sense. It's harsh. God's literally saying, I'm going to make you die in the wilderness. But what God is doing on an upper story level is so crucial. What God is demonstrating to the people of Israel is so crucial. Now, as the story continues, what we find is that exactly what God said was going to happen happens. Israel wanders in the desert for 40 years. I don't know how I had never picked up on this detail before. But when we talk about the Exodus journey, we often talk about how Israel wandered in the desert, but I don't know why, I'd never connected the fact that the reason it happened is because of this right here. God had them on the doorstep of the promised land, but they still didn't trust him. And because they still didn't trust him, God knew he couldn't take the next step in the journey with them. They weren't ready. He had to do more in them so they would be the people that he needed them to be, or else the rescue plan doesn't happen. And so the irony here is, as brutal as this might seem, when we know the rest of the story, it's a mercy and a grace. Because if Israel enters the land unprepared to be who God needs them to be to receive the promised land, they would have become arrogant, they would have become conceited, they would have become prideful, they would have abandoned God altogether. And instead, he says, okay, I'm going to give you exactly what you wanted. I'm going to give you what you wanted. And the consequences were devastating. All Israel could see was what was happening in the lower story, but God was looking at something else entirely in the upper story. God asked Israel to trust what he could see above what they could see. But they couldn't do it because they were so afraid. Ultimately, what Israel did here is the same thing that you and I do time and time and time again in our lives. Rather than placing their faith in who God was and what God had said, they gave into fear of what they could see. See, we can't have faith in God's plans and purposes when we allow fear of what we see to control what we do. It's not possible. Or if I could say it one more way, fear is the biggest thing that prevents us from living in the upper story, from living out God's plans and purposes in our lives. Fear is the number one thing that prevents it. God sees what we can't, and he will, at certain moments in our lives, he will ask us to trust him in ways that don't make any sense to us. He'll ask us to do things that seem insane. He'll ask us to make decisions that we're afraid of. Because what if this happens, or what if that happens, or I can't control this thing, and so God, I'm afraid of it. Now, to be clear, what I'm not saying is that we should never have fear. I'm not saying that. But there's a big difference between having fear in our hearts and yet trusting what God says and who he is enough to do what he asks, and being so afraid that that fear controls our decision making. Israel did, and it led to really destructive consequences. They wanted to kill Moses, who had been faithfully their leader for several years at this point. They wanted to go back to Egypt. God didn't allow them to enter the promised land where they would have experienced abundance and peace. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And eventually this became a problem for Moses too. Because as the story continues, we find that as they continue on this journey, they just keep grumbling and they just keep grumbling and they just keep grumbling. And eventually Moses is sick of it. And so in a moment of anger, Moses disobeys God. And God says, all right, man, you're not going in either. And this man who has faithfully served the Lord for many years is denied his entrance into the promised land too. And it's harsh. It's so harsh. And it would be easy for Moses to say, really? God, after all I've done, God, after the sacrifices I've made, after the ways that I've followed you, even when all the rest of Israel were trying to kill me? But he doesn't. I mean, he's not happy about it. But Moses chooses what we so often don't. He chooses to trust that if God makes this decision, he makes it for a reason. And that reason is a good reason, even if Moses doesn't understand it. And I know that because as we fast forward toward the end of Moses' life, we see that this experience was very formative for him. One of the cool things about reading the Bible in a more narrative kind of a format is you can kind of see connections that otherwise you might not. I've read through the Exodus story many, many times in my life, and I had never connected this before. But in Deuteronomy chapter 31, we find Moses he knows that he's at the end of his life. He knows that he's getting ready to die. And so he begins to lay out final instructions for the nation of Israel. And he begins to set forward the next leader, who is Joshua. And as he does, Moses says a couple of interesting things. And I say they're interesting because when you look at the rest of the narrative, I can't find a time where Moses talks like this until the very end of his life, as he's reflecting and as he's clearly learning from the mistakes that he has made. Page 87 of your storybook, Deuteronomy chapter 31, Moses addressing Israel, he says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, the inhabitants of the land. Don't be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you, and he will never leave you, and he'll never forsake you. And then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. I can't find an example of Moses talking like that before this moment. And as I reflect on Moses' life, as I reflect on his decisions and all the things that he did, Moses was often a man who had just enough fear to prevent him from doing like exactly what God wanted, but still had enough faith that he did do what God wanted. When I read these words, I can't help but think of that moment 38 years earlier when they were on the edge of the promised land, ready to enter. And the fear of the people took over. And if you remember from that, Moses isn't the one who stood up. It was Caleb and it was Joshua. They were the ones that stood up and said, we can't be afraid. The Lord is with us. And I can't help but think, and I'm reading between the lines here, but I cannot help but think that as Moses gives this address to Israel, and as he pulls Joshua up alongside and says, this is your new leader, Joshua, do not be afraid. He's repeating Joshua's words right back to him. I cannot do anything other than believe that what happened in Kadesh Barnea completely flipped how Moses thought about this journey. And what a curious thing for someone to say who God had punished so severely. He says, trust God. He goes before you. He is with you. But Moses was able to reflect on all that God had done for many years. And he was able to say, if God is going to make this decision in my life that I don't want, I trust it because he has proven his character to me time and time and time again. And I'm going to learn from it. And so now I'm going to take this posture of be strong and courageous because the Lord has gone before you. And I also can't help but think that Moses is probably thinking, if you don't get it right here, I really don't want you going through the desert for 40 more years. So be strong and be courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. For the Lord your God is with you, and he goes before you. I don't know what your story looks like. I don't know what your journey looks like through this life. I do know that for every human that lives, we face this test again and again and again and again and again and again. This test of, do I trust that God is who he says he is? That he will do what he says he will do? That he will be faithful? Or do I allow the fear of this thing that's right in front of me to consume me? And do I then orient my life to try to avoid that fear? Do I choose to not step into the promised land because I'm afraid that people will destroy me? Or do I say, I will be strong and I will be courageous, for the Lord goes before me and the Lord is with me? Do you choose to allow the circumstances of your life to determine the steps that you take? Because if you choose to allow the circumstances of your life to determine the steps that you take, I don't know that you can walk in faith with the Lord. Because the Lord says, be strong and be courageous, for I'm with you. I've done it before, I'll do it again. I understand that it's scary, but do you understand that I'm bigger? Do you understand that I've already demonstrated it to you time and time and time and time again? So be strong and be courageous and step into what I've asked. Not because you have all the answers or you know where the road ends, but because you know that I'm with you. And when I'm with you, there is nothing that can stand in your way. Do you have trust in God enough to do what he's asking you to do when what you see in front of you is so much bigger and stronger than you are? Do you have enough faith to step into what God is calling you to when there are giants in your way? Are you more consumed with the fear of things in this world or with the faith in your God who has already overcome them? So to repeat the words of Moses, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. Let's pray.